Before you watch this incredible story unfold, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories about justice, revenge, and the power of karma. You won't believe what happened when this billionaire publicly humiliated his ex-wife at an exclusive dinner. There was a time when powerful men could do whatever they wanted and face no consequences. They could hurt people, humiliate them, and walk away without accountability. But today, something shocking happened at a prestigious charity event in London that proved the world had changed. A wealthy businessman named Richard Ashford stood at a gala event in one of London's most exclusive hotels. He was 54 years old and had built a massive fortune in real estate and finance. He was known in business circles as a ruthless man who crushed his competition and didn't care who he hurt along the way. Richard was standing with a group of investors, drinking expensive champagne and laughing loudly. They were discussing business deals and making jokes about people they considered beneath them. Then Richard's ex-wife walked into the room. Her name was Elizabeth, and she looked absolutely stunning. She wore an elegant emerald green gown that hugged her figure perfectly. Her hair was styled beautifully. Her jewelry was understated, but clearly expensive. She carried herself with grace and confidence. But what made her stand out most was the man on her arm. The man was tall, handsome, and had the kind of bearing that comes from old money and political power. Everyone in the room recognized him immediately because his face had been in the newspapers countless times. His name was Edward Hamilton, and he was the son of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Richard's face went pale when he saw them together. He excused himself from his conversation and walked directly toward Elizabeth and Edward. "Elizabeth," Richard said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I see you're still trying to climb the social ladder. How pathetic." Elizabeth turned to face him calmly. "Richard, I don't think this is the time or place." But Richard wasn't finished. He held up his hand to silence her, the same way you might silence a child. "You always were ambitious beyond your means," Richard continued, speaking loud enough for people nearby to hear. "I gave you everything. I made you who you are. And the moment I left you, you became a nobody. That's why you're here desperately trying to network with anyone who will pay attention to you." Richard turned to Edward with a smirk. "Don't waste your time with her, mate. She's not worth it. She's a gold digger who will do anything to climb higher on the social ladder. She's empty inside." The ballroom had gone quiet. Everyone was watching this confrontation. Edward looked at Richard with cold eyes. Then, slowly, he took Elizabeth's hand and brought it to his lips, kissing it gently in front of everyone. "Actually," Edward said, his voice calm and measured, "you have it all wrong. I'm not here with Elizabeth because she's trying to network. I'm here with my wife." Richard's face turned bright red. "You're your wife?" "Yes," Edward said, placing his arm protectively around Elizabeth's waist. "Elizabeth is my wife. We were married 3 weeks ago. And frankly, sir, I find your behavior appalling. You've just publicly humiliated my wife in front of hundreds of people. I suggest you apologize immediately." Richard looked from Edward to Elizabeth and back again. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. And what happened next would leave everyone in that ballroom absolutely speechless. Understanding the characters and the conflict. Richard Ashford had started his career as a real estate developer. He was ambitious, intelligent, and willing to do whatever it took to succeed. By the time he was 30, he had built his first company and was making serious money. That's when he met Elizabeth. Elizabeth came from a middle-class family. Her father was a doctor, and her mother was a homemaker. She had gone to university and was working as an interior designer when she met Richard at a charity event. He was immediately attracted to her beauty and intelligence. Elizabeth was drawn to his confidence and apparent success. They started dating and were married within a year. For the first few years, the marriage seemed happy. Elizabeth traveled with Richard. She attended his business events. She was introduced to his wealthy friends and became part of his world. But as Richard's wealth grew, his personality changed. He became arrogant and controlling. He treated Elizabeth like a possession rather than a partner. He criticized her appearance, her intelligence, her family, and her career. He told her that she was lucky to be with him and that she would be nothing without him. Elizabeth tried to make the marriage work. She did everything Richard demanded. She dressed the way he wanted. She went to the events he wanted. She even gave up her interior design career because Richard didn't think it was appropriate for a wife of such an important man. For 22 years, Elizabeth endured Richard's emotional abuse. She lost herself completely. Her friends stopped calling because Richard had isolated her. Her family rarely saw her because Richard made visiting them uncomfortable. She became a shell of a person, living only to please a man who didn't respect her. Then one day Richard met someone else, a younger woman from an aristocratic family. He decided that Elizabeth was no longer useful to him. She was too old, too worn down, too ordinary. He filed for divorce. The divorce was brutal. Richard hired the best lawyers and used his wealth to crush Elizabeth. He argued that she had contributed nothing to his success and therefore deserved minimal alimony. He argued that she wasn't a fit mother, though they had no children, and used it against her anyway, just to be cruel. In the end, Elizabeth received a settlement that looked generous on paper, £2 million. But it was a fraction of what Richard's lawyers had initially offered before he changed his mind about divorcing her. Elizabeth was left with a lump sum, no home, no career, and no confidence in herself. She was 52 years old and felt like her life was over. She moved into a small apartment in a less expensive part of London. For the first time in 22 years, she was alone. She had to rebuild her life from nothing. That's when she met Edward. Edward Hamilton was the son of the Prime Minister. He was 48 years old, incredibly wealthy, and had spent his life as a philanthropist and businessman. Unlike his father, Edward didn't go into politics. Instead, he used his family's wealth and influence to help people. Edward had created a foundation that helped women rebuild their lives after divorce or difficult circumstances. The foundation offered counseling, job training, financial literacy classes, and sometimes financial assistance. Elizabeth attended one of the foundation's workshops about financial independence after divorce. Edward happened to be at the workshop that day, volunteering his time to help participants understand investment strategies. They met during a coffee break. Edward was struck by Elizabeth's intelligence and grace. She was clearly struggling, but she had dignity and resilience. They started talking, and over the course of 3 hours, they told each other their life stories. Edward listened as Elizabeth described what she had experienced with Richard. He listened without judgment. He understood, because his own mother had dealt with the pressures of being married to a powerful man, though his father had been far more respectful than Richard. "You know what amazes me?" Edward said. "You're here. You lost everything, and instead of giving up, you came to this workshop. Instead of being bitter, you're trying to rebuild. That takes real strength." "I don't feel strong," Elizabeth said. "I feel broken." "Strength isn't about not breaking," Edward said. "It's about getting back up after you've been broken. And that's exactly what you're doing." They exchanged contact information, and Edward suggested they have dinner sometime. Elizabeth was hesitant. She didn't trust men, especially wealthy, powerful men. But Edward was persistent, and eventually she agreed. Their first dinner was at a small, quiet restaurant. They talked for 5 hours. Edward asked Elizabeth questions about her dreams, her interests, her passions. He listened intently to her answers. He treated her like her thoughts and opinions mattered. Over the next year, they saw each other regularly. Edward was patient and understanding. He didn't push Elizabeth into anything she wasn't ready for. He let her heal at her own pace. He treated her with respect and kindness in ways that Richard had never done. Slowly, Elizabeth began to rebuild her confidence. She started taking interior design projects again, small jobs at first, and then larger ones. She was good at what she did, and people appreciated her work. She realized that her value didn't come from being married to a powerful man. She had value because of who she was. Edward supported her every step of the way. He attended her design project openings. He listened to her talk about her work. He made her feel like her accomplishments mattered. 1 year after they met, Edward proposed. He got down on one knee in the same workshop where they had first met, surrounded by other women who were rebuilding their lives. It was a simple proposal, but it was perfect. "I don't care if you ever become famous or successful," Edward said. "I care about who you are as a person. I care about your strength and your grace and your intelligence. I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" Elizabeth said yes through tears of joy. They were married 3 weeks later in a small, intimate ceremony with only family and close friends. The media caught a few photos, but Edward asked them to respect their privacy. The news did mention that Edward was married, but it wasn't a huge story. Until the gala, the deep conflict and relatable problems. After Richard's public humiliation and Edward's revelation that Elizabeth was his wife, the ballroom erupted into whispers. People who had been friendly with Richard suddenly looked uncomfortable. People who had ignored Elizabeth suddenly wanted to talk to her. But Elizabeth didn't revel in the attention or the schadenfreude. Instead, she looked at Richard with compassion. She understood that he was embarrassed and angry. She understood that his entire worldview had just been challenged. "Let's get some air," Edward whispered to Elizabeth, placing his hand on her back. They walked toward the terrace of the hotel, leaving Richard standing alone in the ballroom, surrounded by people who were already distancing themselves from him. "Are you okay?" Edward asked once they were outside. "I'm fine," Elizabeth said honestly. "I'm actually more concerned about Richard. I know how humiliating this must be for him. I know that he's going to feel like he's lost power." "He deserved to be humiliated," Edward said gently. "He deliberately hurt you in front of hundreds of people. He was cruel and disrespectful. He needed to be held accountable." "I know," Elizabeth said. "But I don't want my happiness to come from his pain. I want to move forward, not get stuck in revenge." Edward pulled her close. "That's one of the things I love about you. You're capable of compassion even for people who don't deserve it." Meanwhile, back inside the ballroom, Richard was experiencing something he had never experienced before: social consequences for his actions. People who had wanted to do business with him suddenly weren't interested. An investor he had been courting publicly distanced himself. The young woman Richard had married after divorcing Elizabeth, thinking she was going to give him status and prestige, suddenly looked worried. Her family didn't want to be associated with someone who was cruel to his ex-wife. Richard tried to do damage control. He approached business associates and tried to explain that Elizabeth had always been ambitious and that he was just being honest about her nature. But nobody wanted to hear it. The man who had been known for his ruthlessness was now known for his cruelty to women. That was a different kind of power, and it was the kind that could destroy you. Over the next few days, the story of what had happened at the gala spread through London's social circles. News outlets picked it up and reported on it. The headline read, "Prime Minister's son's wife turns out to be billionaire's ex-wife he publicly insulted at charity gala." Journalists started investigating the story. They found out about Elizabeth's marriage to Richard. They found out about the divorce settlement. They found out about the age difference between Richard and his new wife. She was 28 years younger than him, which made his criticism of Elizabeth for being too old particularly ironic. One journalist interviewed Elizabeth about what had happened. Elizabeth was hesitant at first, but Edward encouraged her to tell her story. "I don't want to talk about Richard," Elizabeth said in the interview. "I want to talk about what I learned from my experience. I want to talk about how many women experience emotional abuse in their marriages and don't know how to escape it." In the interview, Elizabeth described what it was like to lose yourself in a relationship with a powerful man. She talked about how isolating it was. She talked about how she had internalized all of Richard's criticisms and had come to believe that she really was nothing without him. "But I learned something important," Elizabeth said. "I learned that my value doesn't come from being married to a powerful man. My value comes from who I am as a person. And when I realized that, everything changed. I was able to rebuild my life. I was able to find real love. I was able to remember who I was before Richard." The interview touched a nerve with people around the country. Women who had experienced similar situations started reaching out to Elizabeth. Some had been through emotional abuse. Some had been through financial manipulation. Some had simply been treated as less than by powerful men. Elizabeth started getting messages from women thanking her for speaking out. She started getting invited to speak about her experience at women's organizations and universities. And then something remarkable happened. The Prime Minister, Edward's father, publicly supported Elizabeth's message. He gave a speech about the importance of treating women with respect and about how power should never be used to manipulate or hurt others. "My daughter-in-law," the Prime Minister said in his speech, "has shown tremendous courage in speaking about her experience. She reminds us that wealth and status don't give us the right to treat other people with disrespect. In fact, the opposite is true. The more power we have, the more responsibility we have to use it kindly." The Prime Minister's endorsement amplified Elizabeth's message. Suddenly, she wasn't just the ex-wife who had been humiliated. She was a voice for women who had been silenced by powerful men. Richard, meanwhile, was experiencing the opposite trajectory. His business suffered because investors and partners didn't want to be associated with someone who had behaved so cruelly. His relationship with his new wife fell apart because she didn't want to be married to someone whose reputation was damaged. His social circle abandoned him. But the most painful thing for Richard was understanding what he had lost. He had had Elizabeth for 22 years, and he had treated her terribly. He had told her she was nothing without him. And then, when he left her, she had become everything. She had become confident, successful, respected, and loved. She had become all the things that she could have become if he had supported her instead of tearing her down. 3 months after the gala, Richard requested a meeting with Elizabeth. He sent word through his lawyer that he wanted to apologize. Elizabeth was hesitant, but Edward encouraged her to meet with him. "You don't have to forgive him," Edward said. "But you might want to hear what he has to say. For your own closure, if nothing else." Elizabeth agreed to meet Richard at a coffee shop. It was a public place, neutral territory. Edward sat at another table nearby, just in case things got uncomfortable. Richard looked like a broken man when he arrived. He had aged since the gala. There were new lines on his face. His eyes looked hollow. "Thank you for meeting with me," Richard said quietly. "I'm meeting with you," Elizabeth said calmly. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not meeting with you because I need your apology. I've already moved on from you. I'm meeting with you to give you the opportunity to do the right thing. But understand that nothing you say is going to change my life. I'm already happy without you." Richard nodded. He understood. "I owe you an apology," Richard said. "A real one. Not because I'm embarrassed about what happened at the gala. Not because of the social consequences. But because I was cruel to you, and I knew it was cruel, and I did it anyway." Richard took a shaky breath. "For 22 years, I tore you down because I was insecure," Richard continued. "I was afraid that if you became too successful, you wouldn't need me anymore. So I kept you small. I kept you dependent on me. And then, when I got bored with you, I threw you away and tried to destroy you in the divorce." Elizabeth listened without responding. "The worst part is," Richard said, "I can see now what I couldn't see then. You were always incredible. You were always intelligent and talented and beautiful. But I was so damaged that I couldn't appreciate it. I could only criticize it. I could only try to diminish it." "Why are you telling me this?" Elizabeth asked. "Because I want you to know that none of the things I said about you were true," Richard said. "None of it. You're not a gold digger. You're not a social climber. You're not empty inside. You're one of the most complete human beings I've ever known. And you deserve so much better than what I gave you." Richard's voice broke. "I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me, and I did it deliberately. And now I have to live with that." Elizabeth looked at this broken man in front of her, and she felt a wave of compassion. Not love. Not forgiveness in the sense that she wanted to undo the past. But compassion for someone who had so thoroughly lost his way. "I hope you learn from this," Elizabeth said gently. "I hope you understand that power without kindness is just cruelty. And I hope you find a way to become a better man. Not for me, but for yourself and for anyone else who might cross your path." Elizabeth stood up to leave. "Elizabeth," Richard called out, "do you think you could ever forgive me?" Elizabeth paused and looked back at him. "I already have," she said. "Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger was hurting me, not you. I forgave you a long time ago. I just didn't know I had until now." The moment of justice and transformation. In the months following the gala, Elizabeth's life continued to transform in positive ways. Her interior design business grew significantly. She was getting referrals from people who had seen her speak about her experience. She was being hired by women entrepreneurs and corporate leaders who respected her and wanted to support a woman who had overcome adversity. Edward and Elizabeth decided to establish a charitable foundation together. They called it the Second Chapter Foundation, dedicated to helping women rebuild their lives after divorce, abuse, or other trauma. The foundation provided counseling and therapy services, job training and career coaching, financial literacy and investment education, legal assistance for women going through difficult divorces, housing assistance for women in crisis, mentorship programs connecting successful women with women starting over. The foundation grew rapidly because Elizabeth's story resonated with so many people. She became the face of the foundation, appearing at events and speaking about her journey. Edward's family fully embraced Elizabeth. The Prime Minister's wife, Edward's mother, became close friends with Elizabeth. She was impressed by Elizabeth's strength and resilience. She publicly praised her son for choosing a partner who was not only beautiful, but also intelligent and kind. Edward's father used his political platform to advocate for laws that would protect women in abusive relationships. He pushed for stronger spousal abuse legislation and for equal protection in divorce settlements. He credited his daughter-in-law with inspiring these efforts. Meanwhile, Richard's life continued its downward trajectory, but not in a dramatic way. It was the slow, grinding consequence of his actions. His business lost major contracts. His wealth remained substantial, but it was no longer growing. His social circle continued to shrink. He tried to rebuild his reputation, but every time he appeared in public, people remembered the gala and how he had behaved. Richard eventually remarried, a woman his own age who seemed to appreciate him for who he was. It wasn't the glamorous relationship he had hoped for, but it was based on mutual respect rather than status seeking. Richard became quieter, less public, less concerned with climbing higher. In a strange way, losing everything seemed to force him to become a slightly better version of himself. 2 years after the gala, Elizabeth received a letter from Richard's lawyer. In it, Richard was offering to donate a significant amount of money to the Second Chapter Foundation. The letter included a personal note from Richard. "I cannot undo the harm I caused you," Richard wrote, "but I can support the work you're doing to help other women. I want the Second Chapter Foundation to succeed because I know it will help women who are suffering the way you suffered. If this money can prevent even one woman from going through what you went through, then it will be worth something." Elizabeth discussed the donation with Edward. She was hesitant to accept money from Richard, as it felt like an attempt at redemption that he didn't deserve. "But it's not about him," Edward pointed out. "It's about the women who will be helped by that money. If his money can help them, then it's worth accepting it." Elizabeth accepted the donation on one condition: that Richard's name not be mentioned as a donor. The money would go to help women without any credit to Richard. He agreed. The donation allowed the Second Chapter Foundation to expand significantly. They opened 3 new locations in different cities. They were able to hire more counselors and coaches. They were able to help more women. Elizabeth never forgot where she came from. She never forgot the years she spent being torn down by Richard. That memory became her motivation to build other women up. She made it her mission to ensure that no woman would feel as powerless and invisible as she had felt during her marriage. 1 year after establishing the Second Chapter Foundation, Elizabeth was invited to speak at the university where she had studied interior design decades ago. She spoke to a group of young women who were just starting their careers. "When I was your age," Elizabeth said, "I was so worried about finding the right man and building a life with him. I thought that was going to be my greatest achievement, and I sacrificed so much for that. I gave up my career. I gave up my friendships. I gave up my sense of self. And for what? For a man who didn't respect me? For a relationship that was hollow." Elizabeth looked at the young women. "I'm not saying don't fall in love or don't get married," Elizabeth continued. "What I'm saying is this: build your own life first. Develop your own career. Create your own friendships. Become the person you want to be. And then, if you find someone who respects that person and supports her growth, that's wonderful. But never lose yourself in pursuit of a relationship. Your value doesn't come from being married to someone important. Your value comes from who you are as a person." The speech was recorded and went viral on social media. Millions of people watched it. Young women shared it with their friends and family. Older women watched it and thought about their own lives and the ways they had diminished themselves in relationships. Elizabeth became an unexpected role model for women of all ages. The lasting impact and life lesson. The story of Elizabeth and Richard became a case study in how the world was changing. In an earlier era, Richard could have publicly humiliated his ex-wife and faced no consequences. His wealth and power would have protected him. But in this era, with social media and public accountability, his behavior had consequences. However, Elizabeth's story wasn't really about Richard getting what he deserved. That was just a small part of it. The real story was about Elizabeth becoming who she was always capable of being. Universities started teaching case studies about Elizabeth's journey. Business schools discussed the ethics of how Richard had treated her in their marriage. Psychology professors talked about emotional abuse and how it affected victims' self-esteem. But more importantly, women everywhere started telling their own stories. They started speaking about the ways they had been diminished by powerful men. They started recognizing patterns of emotional abuse in their own relationships. And many of them made the brave decision to leave those relationships and rebuild their lives. The Second Chapter Foundation was recognized as one of the most important charities in the country. It was changing women's lives on a daily basis. Elizabeth and Edward became philanthropists known for their work on behalf of women's empowerment. They gave speeches together about healthy relationships and mutual respect. Edward became known as a man who supported his wife's independence and celebrated her accomplishments rather than trying to control her. The contrast between Richard's marriage and Edward's marriage became a powerful teaching tool. People could see the difference between a relationship based on control and a relationship based on respect. They could see how one kind of relationship diminishes both partners, while the other kind allows both partners to flourish. 5 years after the gala, Elizabeth was invited to speak to the Prime Minister's cabinet about women's rights and economic independence. She stood in the halls of power and told her story to the people who made laws. "I was married to a powerful man who used his power to keep me small," Elizabeth said. "He did this not through violence, but through words, through criticism, through isolation, through financial control. And when I finally left him, I discovered that I was stronger than I thought. I was more capable than he had ever allowed me to be. I was worthy of respect." Elizabeth looked directly at the members of the cabinet. "And I'm telling you this because many of the laws you make affect women like I was. Women who are trapped in relationships with powerful men who use their power to control them. We need stronger protections. We need more support systems. We need a society that recognizes emotional abuse as seriously as it recognizes physical abuse. Because both can destroy a person." The cabinet listened. The Prime Minister, Edward's father, pushed through several new laws designed to protect women in abusive relationships and ensure fair treatment in divorce settlements. The most important law was called the Second Chapter Act. It was designed to ensure that women who had sacrificed their careers and financial independence for marriages would receive fair compensation if those marriages ended. It recognized that a woman's contributions to a family, even if they were primarily non-financial, had value and deserved recognition. The law was directly inspired by Elizabeth's experience. Years later, when people asked Elizabeth what her greatest accomplishment was, she never said it was marrying Edward or becoming friends with the Prime Minister or being recognized as a role model. Instead, she would say, "My greatest accomplishment was discovering that my value doesn't come from anyone else. It comes from me. I'm accomplished because I chose to rebuild my life after it was destroyed. I'm accomplished because I chose to use my experience to help other women. I'm accomplished because I refused to be defined by someone else's cruelty." Elizabeth often thought about that moment at the gala when Richard had humiliated her. She thought about how, in that moment, she could have been destroyed. She could have felt shame. She could have believed his words about her being a gold digger and a social climber. But she didn't, because by that point, she had already rebuilt herself. She had already learned her own worth. She had already become the person she was always capable of being. The moral of Elizabeth's story is clear and powerful. Your worth is not determined by what a powerful person says about you. Your worth is inherent. It comes from who you are as a person, and no amount of criticism or humiliation from someone else can diminish it, unless you allow it to, ***. The story also teaches us something important about power. Real power isn't about making people smaller. Real power is about lifting people up. Real strength isn't about tearing others down. Real strength is about helping others find their own strength. Richard had wielded power to crush Elizabeth. But Elizabeth had taken that crushing and transformed it into something beautiful. She had taken her pain and used it to help thousands of other women. She had taken her experience and used it to change laws and create real societal change. In the end, Elizabeth's power far exceeded Richard's, not because she was wealthier or more famous, but because she used her power for good instead of for harm. The last time Elizabeth and Richard saw each other was at a charity event 5 years after the gala. They were both there supporting different causes, and they happened to be in the same room. Richard approached Elizabeth and Edward respectfully. "I wanted to say thank you," Richard said. "Thank you for not destroying me the way I could have been destroyed. Thank you for showing me that there was another way to live. I'm not the same man I was. I'll never be the man I should have been when we were together. But I'm trying to be better now." Elizabeth smiled kindly. "I'm glad you're trying to be better, Richard. That's what matters. Not the past, but what we do with the present and the future." When Richard walked away, Edward took Elizabeth's hand. "You know, most people in your position would have taken pleasure in his suffering," Edward said. "I know," Elizabeth replied. "But I learned something important from all of this. Suffering isn't noble. It's just suffering. What's noble is transforming that suffering into something meaningful. What's noble is using your pain to help other people avoid the same pain." That is the real power of Elizabeth's story. It's not about a woman getting revenge on a man who hurt her. It's about a woman transforming her pain into purpose. It's about a woman who discovered that she was more than what someone else said she was. It's about a woman who used her own journey to light the way for thousands of other women. And that is real justice. Not revenge, but transformation. Not destruction, but healing. Loudspeaker final call to action. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to see more stories about justice, redemption, and the power of women to overcome adversity. Stories about standing up for yourself and transforming pain into purpose. Comment below and tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone? Have you ever had to rebuild your life after heartbreak? Have you ever used your pain to help someone else? We'd love to hear your stories. ****. The real moral of this story is profound. Your worth is not determined by what others say about you. Your worth comes from within. And when you believe in yourself and your value, nobody can take that away from you. More importantly, when you overcome adversity, you have the power to help others overcome theirs. Use your strength to lift others up. Use your voice to speak for those who have been silenced. Use your journey to light the way for others. ****. If you know someone who is being diminished or controlled by a powerful person, share this story with them. Let them know that there is life after that relationship. Let them know that they are capable of becoming the best version of themselves. Let them know that their worth is not determined by someone else's opinion. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. The incredible power of women to overcome, to transform, and to triumph over adversity. ****.